For the live stream?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, I can use that, and then that gets, right. I forgot that this gets recorded too, otherwise I just look up here. Hello. Okay, we are ready. Sorry for the slight delay. We had some technical difficulties. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Victor Kuperman. I've known Victor,
15 years.
15 years since he came to McMaster. Our kids went to school together. We've co-supervised one student, and I've sat on committees, and really one of the best examples of an associate member of our department, always contributing. So Victor got his bachelor's in linguistics at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a master's, he tells me, in library science, where he learned some statistics, also at Hebrew U. And then he went to the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics and got a PhD, and finally a postdoc in Stanford before he was hired here at McMaster in the departments of linguistics and language, where he's a full professor. And what's your role in REL? Are you the director? No, you're
just
a member of REL, the REL research group, which is not part of linguistics and language, but related. And today he's going to tell us about what is the universal and what is specific in the basic facts of eye movement control during reading. So everybody give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, and thank you for having me here. I think this is my second time in the 15 years to give a talk in this specific forum, but in all other capacities, the connections run deep, right? So there are multiple committees and other forums at which we at the Linguistics and Languages collaborate with psychology. So don't forget about us. We're just next door in Wilson Building, and think of us as the language part of your group. So it's always exciting to give a talk here because I always run the risk of boring the audience completely because I'll be talking about a very specific topic, right? So not only language but reading. But I hope you'll find interesting snippets both about the actual content of the talk and about the fact that it's going to be about a large project, multinational, multi-lab project, and the logistics of running it. So if not one aspect or another will keep you interested, I hope. So I'll start with saying that the entire idea of universals of language is as long-standing and as alive today as it was about 3,000 years ago when it first appeared in the Sanskrit writings of the Indian philosopher. Right? The idea was that being exposed to multiple languages, one cannot but wonder why are they so different, but also to some degree they work in the exact same way. And this tug of war between what's shared between languages in their structure and what is specific to the languages is one of the major topics in linguistics and really any language research. So most recently in the theoretical literature, this has been picked up by Greenberg and Chomsky. And then a move has happened from just the structures of languages being whether universal or specific to the idea that behavior when doing language can be universal or specific as well. There's this tug of war there as well. And so there's been very interesting work specifically on word recognition until we graduated all the way to text reading behavior. And that's what this talk is about. Right? We're going to look at how people read texts in different languages, in their first languages or even second ones, and what is shared in these behavioral phenomena across all readers and what is different. So why do we even expect universality? Well, it's really the case that writing systems might be very different across the world, but they're governed by the same general principle, and the cognitive processes of reading are shared as well. So in any language, we start with a written symbol in reading, and we arrive at the meaning of the written text. And we have to go through the same stages of visual processing, then word identification, language processing. That's where we rely on our oral language knowledge. And all the while we're referring to the knowledge of the language, which which of course has multiple levels to it. So we need to know the words and the syntax and the morphology and what the meanings of words are, and we have to rely on our knowledge of the world as well. That's the top part here, right? And of course, all the readers are sharing the same underlying domain general structures like eye movement control and working memory, executive control, and so on. Not to mention that the visual anatomy is more or less the same for readers of every language, as is the basic wiring of our brains. So there are many reasons to think that we'll find universality in reading behavior. What are the reasons to think that there will be specificity to different languages and different writing systems? Well, writing systems are not the same. They show major differences that we'll talk about in a second. But also, if we forget about reading for a second, all languages are not the same either. They're structured differently, some for historical reasons, some genetically, and we're talking about the genealogy of languages. But to give you just some examples, different languages have different mapping of letters or characters to sounds. So mapping of writing to phonology is extremely transparent in languages like Finnish. So you can read Finnish, I can read Finnish. If we know the Roman alphabet, we can do it perfectly well. So kissa stands for a cat, as you might have guessed. Korean, on the other hand, has a very different principle in the organization of their writing system. Each character represents a syllable, and each symbol within a character represents a phoneme. So it's transparent, right? If you know the language, you will read it perfectly well. But each unit that you see on the screen is a syllable consisting of multiple characters. And then there's Chinese, where each character represents a syllable, and these have to be learned by rote as opposed to the alphabet, where the mapping between the characters and sounds is more or less regular. Now, the visual complexity across writing systems is very different. So English has uppercase and lowercase, and typically alphabetic languages are pretty simple, visually speaking. Then we have very visually complex systems like, say, Arabic, which also changes the shape of a character depending on its position in the word. So the same letter occurring in the beginning, the middle, or the end of the word will have different shapes. So Japanese is presenting us with yet another form of grapheme. So even on the visual complexity front, writing systems are different, and of course this has consequences for perception and visual perception and word recognition, and the difficulty of reading in those languages. Word boundaries, just to go to the next point, most languages that we know of use spaces or some other means of segmenting words or marking the boundaries between words. Not all of them do, right? So Chinese and Thai do not. So there is an additional problem of where one word begins and where the next one ends. The constant problem that the readers of these languages have to be solving. Then the morphological structure is very different across languages, and we can go on and on to talking just about the specifics of oral languages and writing systems. So somewhere in between these two, the universality and specificity, that's where our research is. We're trying to figure this out. Now, to be able to ask these questions, we need good data. And we don't have good data, or we did not have it until very recently. So this is a report of bibliometric analysis done in 2022. So these are all the papers that are written on eye movements in reading in a time span from 2000 to 2018. So you can see that the field is dominated by work on English. There's a decent and ever-increasing representation of Chinese, German, Dutch, French, and Finnish. It really runs by whichever country has a good eye tracking lab and the resources to collect the data. But even with these numbers, we're looking at a very uneven representation. It's both uneven and narrow. So in order for us to be able to do comparative analysis of reading behavior in languages, we need the data that would be comparable in quality, in the content, done with a similar apparatus. Ideally, we would have participants that are of the same level of proficiency. So try to equate, to level the field and collect data that would represent as many written languages as we can. So just on this topic, until 2018, there were only 40 studies that conducted a direct cross-linguistic comparison. That's two languages sort of had to have being compared to one another. And of these, 37 had only two languages and only 3 had data from 3 languages. So we need to grow this much more in order to be able to say anything sensible about the cross-linguistic research. So things have changed since 2018 and since 2020. There's a large number of single language corpora or collections of eye tracking data in reading in first language and second language. I will code them as L1 and L2, so first and second language. And perhaps most importantly for the present purposes, there are now several multilingual corpora that are available as well. There's still no cross-linguistic computational models, so whatever models we have, and they're elaborate and very precise, but one is married to English and another one is married to German, and even expanding the German one to Dutch falters, right? Even though these two languages are very similar to one another. So this is sort of the landscape in which I will talk about our own work. So how do we study universal versus specific behavior? Well, one idea is to, historically, what was happening is that researchers identified basic facts of eye movement control in specific languages, and that's really the last 50 years of eye tracking research were dedicated to that. Hardly ever with other languages in mind, typically just one phenomenon at a time, right? Sometimes replicated, sometimes expanded, but typically tied to a single language. So the growing field to which this work belongs as well is to compare facts across multiple written languages and writing systems. And the next step that we did not get to yet, but hopefully the field will, is to develop computational models that account for diversity of writing systems. So this is a very informal and very simplified flowchart that I keep for myself. Just how do I go through my research, right? So I will take a phenomenon, right, in eye movement behavior that would be identified in prior literature. I would look at it in multiple languages, and I will try to see whether this behavior is uniform across languages. If the answer is yes, then I will put a label of universal to it. So that's the behavior that does not depend on a specific writing system or, well, specifics of the written language. If not, if I see a variability across languages in a certain aspect of eye movement behavior during reading, I will ask, can I link this variability to something that is inherent in those languages, to the structural properties of the languages that are being read? So can I find the reason why the behavior varies? If yes, then this is a behavior that is specific to languages, but it's systematic, right? And ideally, we would identify the cause for it. And of course, there might be cases when the variability is there and I cannot find the cause, right? So I couched it in terms of me specifically doing research, and I will be presenting that, but the flowchart will work for the field of cross-linguistic research and reading as well. So what I'll do in this talk is we'll select several very well-attested facts of reading behavior. We'll test how they manifest across multiple written languages and identify their position on that flow chart. And then, hopefully we'll talk about what this adds to the existing knowledge of reading behavior. So actually, I like showing this. Well, those profs who have been around for longer know this person. It's Alex Goch. He has a PhD from your department. He also worked for a brief while in my lab. Now he works for a company called SI Research, which produces the best eye trackers in the world. I'm not being paid commission. I just like their products very much. So for this audience, it's probably very redundant, but of course the text reading with eye tracking looks like this. There's a person sitting in front of the screen, reading the text from the screen. There's a box below the screen that registers the eye movements in a very precise and rapid way. And this is a very schematic representation of what in real time, what the eye movements can look like when reading in text. Now, it's a text in English. I just downgraded the quality so that it looks better. But the point is that the eyes stop at certain pieces of text for short periods of times. We call them fixations. Then they move not smoothly, but in jumps. We call this saccades. And so essentially, it's the eye movement record is the record of the fixations and saccades, where people look for how long and where they move next. Right? So, and it's easy to see that some words are not even fixated once, they're being skipped. And some are, the eye just flies over, right? These are the skips. And sometimes the eye goes back, typically to reread some content that has been unclear. So we call these regressions, and so on. So this is just to give you an idea of what kind of data we're working with. And okay. So from the eye movements, we're getting a very rich record, behavioral record of reading, and some of this is defined at the passage level. So we get the reading rate, the words per minute. Also, in the text that we are providing to our readers, we're asking them comprehension questions, so we get comprehension accuracy as well, just to understand how well how much they understood the text. But at the word level is where the most magic happens, right? So we get, I won't walk you through all of this, but we get a very detailed account of whether they looked at the word for how long, how many times they went back and forth between this word and the others, and so on. So now finally we come to the to the centerpiece of this talk. It's the multilingual corpus of eye movements, or MECO for short. And this is a project that we started together with Noam Sigelman and Sasha Schroeder from Israel and Germany, respectively. And it's been going on since 2019, so about 6 years, but of course with the pandemic in the middle, during which we did not collect eye movement data. And so the idea was to try and collect eye tracking data on text reading, both in the first language of the reader and English as the second language. I mean, for Canadians, English was not the second language, but for most of our national samples, it was. So, and the overarching idea is to create a broad typological picture of reading behavior across languages and writing systems. Because we collected the data in the first and the second language within participants, we would also have an insight, not just in how they read in their second language, but how their reading in the first and the second language correlate, right? Can we find any links there? So, like I said, the project was launched in 2019. The first publications came out in 2022, and that's the one that you have, that I sent around. And in line with the desiderata of this research project, we're looking at comparable readers. They're all university students. These are comparable texts translated back and forth to ensure comparability. The apparatus is the same. These are always the eye links, so the eye trackers from the company that Alex Goch is working for. And so I'll skip the technical details of many kinds, but I just want to say that once the data is published, it's in open access, and I really invite everyone to make use of it as much as you find useful and beneficial for your work. So what we're trying to do with the data, well, besides the constant collection and cleaning and the actual publication, is this, right? First of all, we want to find links between the diversity of languages and scripts and the behavioral expressions when reading those languages. So behavioral universals and variability, that's the tug of war I've been talking about. What is the link between L1 and L2 reading? That's another big question. And another one is the development of cross-linguistic computational models of eye movement control in reading. Here's what the corpus looks like. We took some texts that we thought were culture neutral, right? So they were not particularly swayed towards any specific world knowledge. We were proved very wrong once we moved to Far East and some Asian countries and so on. But this is a good example of a text where we took something from Wikipedia, edited it for clarity and shortened it a bit. And this is the text that was then translated from English to, well, in this case, German, Hebrew, Turkish, Russian, right? And each time we would do that, we would have some, well, a partner translate it into their language, and then another person would back translate it into English so that we can catch any inconsistencies and correct. So the first wave of MECO covered 13 countries, and then the second wave that we're working with now, we'll submit these papers very soon, expanded this a fair bit. And there's a third wave coming very soon, which adds even more countries. So in a nutshell, we're looking at a whole bunch of European languages, not necessarily Indo-European, but coming from different linguistic families, including, say, Finnish. But as far as quote-unquote exotic languages are concerned, well, exotic being non-alphabetic, right, and with more complex writing systems, we have Chinese, Korean, Hebrew, Arabic, we have Hindi, and traditional Mongolian, right? Traditional Mongolian is perhaps the only script that is written vertically these days, right? So, this is the idea, right? To try and cover as many written languages of the world as we can, and draw comparative analysis. So mostly I'll be talking about results from the first wave, because that's the one that is published completely. And here we're looking at the text reading in 13 language samples, both in the first and second language. Okay, so the first question we asked is this. We can get a lot of measures from the eye movement record, right? Which of the measures is the most discriminatory, right? Which one is the one that the languages are particularly different on? So this is just a small sample showing you the means by language, and I'll skip that and give you the result already. So once we looked at the variance that is explained by language as a factor in each behavioral measure, we found that the strongest cross-linguistic differences were in skipping. So it's really whether or not, or what was the likelihood of actually fixating on the word or skipping it altogether. This is the one measure that separated or discriminated between the languages the most. If the word was fixated, interestingly, even though the languages were extremely different from one another, the fixation time was more or less the same, right? So the processes that are involved in word recognition are not particularly different across languages. It's whether we skip something or not. And one of the obvious ways, one of the obvious culprits for this variability was word length, right? So if you think about, say, Chinese versus Finnish, and we just had this discussion over lunch, Chinese has words that are typically 2 to 3 characters long, so they're very small. Finnish has words that can easily go to 20 letters and so on. So it's much easier to skip a 2-character word than a 20-letter word. So what this plot shows to you is the mean word length of a language, and that's on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical, you see a likelihood of the word being skipped. So in the top left corner, we have Korean. Again, a very condensed writing system with 3 to 4 characters constituting every word. And on the, and you have Estonian and Finnish in the bottom right corner. Both languages are related to one another and both feature extremely long words. So there's effectively almost a perfect correlation, negative correlation between these two parameters. And so the longer the words in the language, the less likely they are to be skipped. It's not particularly revolutionary, right? It's something to be expected, but you need a corpus like this for a microscopic view, right? So by looking at each language specifically, or any pair of those, at best you can speculate at what drives this very important aspect of eye movement behavior. So now we know, and now if there is a computational model that is designed to account for a lot of languages, right, this will be one of the parameters. And there is a numeric estimation that can help with this slope. So this is a specific behavior, right? It varies by languages, but it's very systematic. Okay, so let's proceed to the next chapter, right? So we're looking at the so-called benchmark effects in first language reading. So in reading, if a person is proficient in the language that they read, there will always be a word length effect. So longer words take longer to read than shorter words. And there will always be a frequency effect, right? So words that occur more frequently in the language will take less time. So the word length effect, both are called the benchmark effects. That's because how completely expected they are. So word length effect is there because the more linguistic material we have, the more letters, sounds, syllables, morphemes are there to the word, the more complex it will be to process. And the word frequency effect is associated with either familiarity of a reader with the word or their experience with the word. So the more we've seen it, the more we have exposure to the word, the faster this recognition will be. So we're looking at the metric of linguistic complexity and metric of experience with the word. Now we want to know how universal they are, and this is the subject of a follow-up paper on, well, it says 12 alphabetic languages. We had to exclude Korean because how different it is from all the others. But the question here was very simple. If we do estimate word length and word frequency effects for all these languages in statistically similar ways using comparable materials, will they have a similar or different effect size of the effect? And again, word length and word frequency are the core of any computational model of reading. So knowing that will be important for the future cross-linguistic computational models. Okay, so we have word length here, and without spending too much time on explaining the plot, so let's look just at this one. This is total reading time. So how much time is spent reading the word? We have word length on the horizontal axis and the total reading time on the vertical, and essentially all these lines are parallel, right? So they differ in their intercept, and we sort of know that because in some languages, words just take longer to read than the others, but for every unit of word length, for every character and so on, once we standardize them across languages, the effects are exactly of the same size. So adding one character adds the same amount of processing effort in the alphabetic languages that we're looking at. Word frequency is very similar. So again, looking at the same plot for total reading time, like we said, the more frequent the word, the faster we read it. So the lines are in the negative direction, and statistically speaking, they're parallel. So there's no difference. Again, seeing a word one more time, right, one extra time in your experience, buys you the same benefit in milliseconds. And it doesn't matter whether it's Turkish or Italian or Russian or any of the 12 languages that we looked at. So the benchmark effects in L1 reading are nearly universal among proficient readers of alphabetic languages. Spoiler alert, we're now going to non-alphabetic languages because we have more data, and it's very different there. Mostly because a letter or a character means a very different thing in Finnish or English versus Chinese or Hindi. So that's something we'll need to work out still, but in the alphabetic domain, it's a universal feature. Benchmark effects are of the same size. Okay, so the next step was for us to go to the very authoritative reviews of literature by Keith Rayner. So it's probably not an exaggeration to say that if you're doing anything to do with on eye movements in reading, these are the papers you read like within the first months of familiarizing yourself with the field because of how comprehensive they are. And the late Keith Rayner was a major figure in the field, and he issued multiple of these literature reviews. So it's like a compendium of the consensus in the field, right? So if a fact is mentioned there, it's been found many times in many languages, and yeah. So what we're doing is a bit bold, right? We're taking the playbook and we're retesting most of the statements across multiple languages using the ability of, using the macroscopic tool that we now have. So in this comparisons, I'm including more languages, some from the first and some from the second wave. And so let's look at the reanalysis of at least some of the statements from Keith Rayner's work, this time in 15 languages. So we'll look at the 3 of them, and each time I'll provide a quote from the literature review and then the actual analysis. So the first fact is about the boundaries of the text that we read. So we don't start with the first letter, we don't end with the last letter on the line, we actually move in and leave the line a little later and a little earlier, respectively. So the first and last fixations on the line are generally 5 to 7 letter spaces from the ends of the line. That's about 80% of the text typically falls between the extreme fixations. Okay, so let's see if that's true. Right, and this is just to show that the first fixations are not on the very first character, and the last ones are also a little offset from the end of the line. And this has to do, of course, with the fact that we have the parafoveal preview, which allows us to see more characters, and this is done for efficiency. And there's a linguistic predictability that allows us to predict what the upcoming words are without always looking at those. So from our data, we extracted the leftmost and the rightmost fixations on each line. And the proportion of characters in between these two boundaries was actually very similar to Keith Rayner's estimate, from 65% to 80%, and yeah, with fairly little variability. So yes, it's the observation that is confirmed, and I'm just plotting it here with, in tiny print, the names of the language samples on both ends, but you can see how that announced pattern repeats itself essentially in every language sample that we've collected. Okay, so it's pretty close to universal behavior. Let's look at the next statement, and there's like a list of maybe 50 of those. We'll only go through 3, and we're on the second now. So let's look at refixations. Right? It's quite commonly the case that a word is not read with just one fixation. Sometimes the eye has to well, the jump of the eye is still within that same word, and it's usually happening when the word is either long or complex in some way. Or sometimes it's also because our oculomotor target, our saccadic targeting is not ideal, so we need to correct ourselves. So Rayner's observation is this. When readers make two fixations on a word, in the vast majority of cases, an initial fixation on the word is followed by a rightward movement within the word. And we're talking English, right? So left to right systems. By far the most frequent pattern is to fixate near the beginning of the word, followed by a fixation near the end of the word. So this is what we're mimicking here, right? That's by far the most frequent pattern. And the alternative would be the one where we land towards the end of the word and then jump back a little. So I want to look at the proportion of these two scenarios in a bunch of languages and see what happens. So it is true that on average across languages, in the scenario that was mentioned as the most common occurs like 2/3 of the time. So it's supporting Rayner's summary. But there's massive variability across languages. So in Finnish and Turkish, about 70% of second fixations go forward and 30% go back. But in Chinese, it's 50-50, right? So you can go in the expected or the modal direction or the other one. And again, you can already predict that this must have something to do with differences in word length. If you're looking at words that only have two characters, like most words in Chinese, it's very easy to miss, to land on the second character and then go back to the first one. In Finnish, where words are huge, it's very unusual to go all the way to the end of that long word and then regress. So we have a plot here where the mean length of the word in the language is on the horizontal axis, and the proportion of the most common scenario is on the vertical. And you see a pretty strong correlation of 0.62, where languages like scripts like Chinese, simplified and traditional, are almost at chance, right, in which of the patterns is preferred. And long languages like Turkish and Finnish and Estonian are over 70% in the preference of the pattern that Keith Rayner named the most common one. So again, I don't think any of this work is particularly revolutionary. It's to be expected, but what we're getting is a very systematic view of what drives the differences. And that's what computation models of the future are thriving on, right? Knowing and getting the numeric estimates for the differences. So this pattern is language specific, but also systematic. It's straightforwardly related to the distribution of word length in the written languages. Let me give you the last example, the so-called wrap-up effect. So the wrap-up effect is, I'll cite it first. I'll quote it first. Readers have longer fixations at the end of clauses and sentences. And that's typically because, so when we read, we tend to spend a little more time at the end of the sentence. That's because the theory is that this is where we're making sense of what we read in the sentence. So all the words have been identified. We're pausing, we're spending this moment to semantically integrate the mental representation of the meaning of the sentence, and then move with that representation to the next sentence or the next syntactic clause. And the way it looks in empirical data is, so if we have word position on the horizontal axis, towards the end of the sentence you get this increase in reading times. So that's the hallmark of the wrap-up effect. Again, an extremely well-attested phenomenon. So to study this, we had to prepare our materials a little, because we're working, of course, with sentences now. Sentences are of a very different length. Not only the words are of different length, but the syntax of a language, the grammar, dictates how long the sentences are going to be. So within every language, we took every sentence and and separated it, binned it into 10 equal-sized bins based on their position in the sentence. And you can see that Finnish, because, well, it has long words, but it also has the shortest sentences, like 15-word long sentences. Chinese, the other way around, short words but long sentences. We can talk about the morphology and the syntax of it, but I think it's intuitive why it works like that. So in each bin, we had 2 to 4 words, and the most interesting comparison for our purposes is what happens in the last bin. That's where the wrap-up effect should be happening, compared to the preceding one, where we should not see the semantic integration or any pause. It's still sort of the sentence processing is still in course in that preceding the penultimate bin. Okay, so every panel represents a language, and for every panel we have the bin, right, the relative word position in the sentence on the horizontal axis, and reading times or gaze duration on the vertical. So I'm only showing this to highlight that we'll be concentrating on the last 2 bins, so marked in red. So I'm zooming on these right now. And so in every panel, except for 3, we see the wrap-up effect. So in most panels, you will see that the last bin took a little longer to process than the one before last. And that's the case here, and that's the case here and here. So in all bins except for 3, that we see the evidence of the wrap-up effect, and it's on the order of 10 to 15 milliseconds of an extra processing time. What are these 3 bins where we don't see it? It's Chinese, the simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese, and Korean. So in our sample, these are the only 3 languages with very different visual complexity, and there are more things that are different in these languages, including the structure of a regular sentence and so on. So there's a very clear separation here between the alphabetic languages and the languages using other writing systems. And based just on these data, we cannot really tell, or we should not be. We can guess, we can speculate, but we don't know the cause of the absence of the wrap-up effect. So this is where we are combining the corpus-based work, which is inherently correlational, with experimental work. So I'm now running an experiment with my colleagues with readers of simplified Chinese and readers of traditional Chinese with much better controlled stimuli to see if indeed we can replicate the absence of the wrap-up effect and see what is behind it. Is it the visual complexity? Is it the syntax? And so on. So invite me again in some years and I'll let you know what the result is. But so far there's a clear divide between writing systems. Okay. So to summarize, what we're doing is collecting the data and using the data to check the basic factors of eye-movement control cross-linguistically. And some of these prove to hold universally. Some are variable across languages, but there's a very clear cause for that variability. And some others are still to be discovered and to be explained. And probably the explanation will come from the follow-up work with experiments, tightly controlled experiments on specific languages that show the deviation from the overall pattern. So what we hope this to grow into, besides the empirical work, is the effort of creating computational models and correcting the existing computational models and theories of reading behavior to account for the fact that there are actually many different languages and they have different structures, they look differently, and they are both a little universal but also a little specific. And I'll end here, and I thank you so much for your attention.
Hi, thanks for the talk. 2 questions. One was, I'm curious about skipping and wondering if that has any effect on comprehension, if you're skipping a lot of words, and if not, why not? And my second question is, I gather your experiments use typeface, like computer or whatever.
Mhm.
Do these results generalize to like handwritten, like printed or script?
Right. So it's easier to answer the second question. I don't know, truly. So we're working indeed with, with fonts. There's quite some fuss that has to go into selecting the fonts and so on, but I would not know how that generalizes. The first question, so there were no differences in comprehension, and we had pretty good comprehension questions. And typically, yes, people some languages skip a lot, but partly this is because it's worth skipping, right? So in English, if you skip a lot of function words, right, in the house of mine, right, if you get house and a bit of mine, right, you can figure out the rest. So the predictability of the words that are skipped is typically very high. Now, in languages like Finnish, you don't skip a lot because these grammatical relations are actually baked into the word. They're added like as suffixes. Agglutinative languages do that. So you pay a much higher price if you skip a word like this. But it's also longer, so it's physically or visually more difficult to skip. Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very interesting. Yeah, one word that you just said now, but I didn't hear in your whole talk, was predictability. So that must be playing a big role because some words, of course, would be very predictable. So I'm assuming you can skip over those really quickly, or your brain already knows what they are, so you don't have to focus on them. And that must interact with the grammatical structure, the syntactic structure, because different bits of information come in at different times in different languages. And I wonder if it also might relate to essentially what I would call pausing on the last
Wrap up.
sentence. Now, I study music, so we look at these kinds of things a lot in music, and people pause, if they're playing music, they pause at the end. And we've sort of thought about it in informational terms, rather. People traditionally say in music it's because you pause at the end of a phrase because you're trying to show your audience the structure, and it's at the end of it. But in fact, what we found is that if you relate it to entropy,
Mhm.
basically at the end of, you pretty much know what the end of the word is going to be, or the noun is coming out, but you don't know what's coming. So there's you might need more cognitive processing, some more time at those places where you don't know what's coming. So I'm sort of rambling on, but my basic question is how do you think prediction comes into it and that would differ across languages at sort of a specific level?
Yeah. So both are great questions. Predictability is something we're working on very actively now because, yeah, it's one of those benchmark predictors where we need to account for that. And the reason I haven't talked about it is that it's technically very difficult. So we're engaging all kinds of large language models to generate predictions for us for the text in all the different languages. My partners and collaborators know much more about that, and that's why they get into constant fights. One says, we use ChatGPT-4, and the other one says, no, it needs to be MBERT. And in between these conversations, we have not yet arrived at the actual predictability estimates. We will also be doing the good old-fashioned close predictability, where people are reading a sentence, and that one word is missing. They have to guess what it is, and from multiple responses, we'll be estimating that. So this is very much on the forefront of the project, just nothing to show for it yet. For the pause at the end of the phrase, I may be wrong, but I think you're talking about production, right? So effectively, the musician shows the audience that here's. Now, when we read, we don't show anything to anyone. There is, of course, oral reading that, say, parents do to children, and I'm sure that this is what happens there as well. But for reading for comprehension, there's no production component to it.
We've actually been, that's really interesting. We've actually been arguing that in music it's less about showing the audience, even though it is production, and it's more about the cognitive load that you need at particular points.
Mhm.
So you can get people to present, every time they button press, they get the next node and the next word. And they don't know what's coming next.
Mhm.
They still pause every, they don't know that that's a phrase.
Right.
Just because it's completely correlated with how sure you are about your ability to predict what's coming next. So it's hard to know which or both are at play.
Thank you, that's very interesting. Now we have to figure out why the readers of Chinese and Korean don't do that, but the point holds.
Yeah, that's the real, I wondered if it had anything to do with predictability.
Mm. Very likely. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm thinking about differences in complexity across languages and the impact on working memory.
Mm.
So, has anybody looked at, again, the more complicated languages that don't have as many universals or show these effects? Has anybody looked, is the working memory capacity of people who speak that language as a first language greater?
Mm.
Like, because it's a developmental thing, like your capacity for working memory. And so if you're dealing with a really complicated language that has a lot of uncertainties, then you should have a larger working memory capacity to deal with that.
That's a great one. I'm not aware of this work, but Lauren seems to
Oh,
have a
no,
comment.
I wanted to hear your answer, and I was just going to piggyback to David's question. So, like languages that are tonal or not, and then also I was curious if you could just speculate. I know it's not in this data set, but it's a super cool data set, by the way. But people's like auditory imagery, if they're reading in their head, and how that might differ across these languages. I see it as somehow related also to David's working memory questions. So just to ask you to speculate.
Right. So we have not, of course, tested our participants for any of that, and in all fairness, the experiment was already 2 hours, so we could not. But right, so for tones, it's a little easier to answer because, well, even with say Chinese or Arabic for that matter, well, yeah, let's stick with Chinese. We have Mandarin and Cantonese readers, so the written language is the same, right? But the tonal structure exists in both languages, but it's different. So it's hard to say how silent reading for comprehension would fire the it will do something to auditory imagery, just very hard to say whether it's how it will play out and affect reading. I'm not aware, David, to your question, I'm not aware of any studies that would sort of systematically look at speakers of different languages in terms of their working memory, but yeah. If I ever grow bored of this multinational project, I might run another one, right, doing exactly that. But truly, I wouldn't know. Yeah.
So in some way, you use the word length as horizontal as, and I guess that's understandable because you study language. But I'm thinking about to what extent that could be explained by visual angle. So let's say if you correct for visual angle, maybe that difference, let's say if we related in terms of a single glance, how much you can see, how wide you can see. Related.
So,
glance, how much you can see, how wide you can see.
yeah. So, great point. Words, even in very long languages, don't tend to take as much space on the screen as to elicit substantial differences in visual angle, right? So, yes, of course, different word length would also mean, in pixels or in characters, would also mean different visual angles. But some work many decades ago has shown that unless it's a character like that versus a character like that, it doesn't matter that much. So it's the font size is sort of a negligibly small factor in reading studies. Mm-hmm.
Just a question about where these universals come from. Do you think it's that the way text is formatted over the centuries has changed to match the way we process language in our visual system? Or is it that our skill of reading, at least in these languages, has come to match the way the text is presented? Or is it both? I mean, I don't know anything about the history of books, but I'm assuming that 1,000 years ago, the text was very different than it was today.
Exactly. So it's both. I think it's both to answer your question. Because, yeah. So as far as the evolution of written text goes, well, it started with either drawing, we were discussing this, right? Some languages would draw their first symbols on the shells of turtles, right? And others would take a chisel and do it on the stone. Of course, there was nothing like straight lines, right? They would write in every possible way just to fill the space that is given to them. So the standardization, especially the one that we see now in digital form on the screen with a well-adjusted font, is definitely part of the evolution that's, well, standardizes the input, and so it standardizes the process. That's one thing. Another thing is that, of course, all our participants are university students in respective countries. So they've gone through years and years of schooling, which in the modern day is done in a fairly standardized way as far as printed input is concerned. So they're all trained to read not just the specific content, but specific typography, specific layout of the screen. And so I think we're looking at two co-evolving entities that are met in this in this project, right? And yeah, probably that's the most standardized we'll ever see, or we have ever seen in the evolution of reading.
Thanks so much. Really interesting. I have lots of questions. I'd love to talk to you afterwards. But for a specific one, I guess, looking at that fixation, like first versus final, did you have Korean for that study?
Yes,
Okay.
and Chinese. Yeah. Mhm.
Interesting. Okay, so I wonder why your conclusion was then that it was word length and not the fact that Chinese doesn't use spaces between words. Because Korean also has very short word length, but it does use spaces.
Mhm.
So it feels like that visual break between words might be more of an effect in terms of where your eye is landing and then having to move.
So, right, so having or not having spaces is definitely a major factor. Korean was very similar to Chinese in this respect. I will try and circle back. So, right. So Chinese is here, Korean is here, right? So even if we did not have Chinese, we would probably have reached the same. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question about
Yeah.
that graph?
Yeah, of course.
So the correlation's really great, but I couldn't help but noticing, I don't know what SP is, that's Spanish.
Spanish, yes.
So do you think that that's just noise, or is there like some idiosyncratic thing about that language?
Mm.
I mean, how much data do you have for that point? to
Right.
See if that's a real deviation.
Mm-hmm. So we have about 50 participants per language, and of course each reads 12 texts and so on. But you know what, with this data I cannot answer it, but luckily as we collect more waves, there are samples with the same language coming from different countries, and sometimes even from the same country. So like 3 samples of German. And this is great, because right now we cannot tell so we have an English sample that was represented by Canada McMaster Reading Lab at the Department of Linguistics and Languages. Is this the most representative sample we can get? What if so the point is clear. Once we get multiple samples of the same language, ideally from the same country, but to account for regional differences, but even from different countries, we can then start inferring whether it's just a blip of that specific Spanish sample, which happens to be from Argentina. And now we're getting one from Chile, close enough. So it's not on this plot, but we'll get to see if that's something inherent in the language or just a sample gone wrong.
For the fixation of like progression moving forward and backwards, I was just wondering, do you think that if someone is raised in a language, let's say Chinese, where it's commonly going back and forth, they would have trouble, adapting to a new language, let's say English, where it's like constantly moving forward and out, like another additional learning period?
Not really. And if there is any interference, it would be for a very short time. So there's very interesting work done on readers of, say, Hebrew and English, and then as follow-up Arabic and English, because these are 2 different directions altogether, not just different patterns of going back and forth, but right, whether you read this way or the other way. So once the proficiency of Hebrew-speaking children in English reaches a fairly basic level, they adjust very well, right? So they do the same eye movement control as the developing American children, say.
So you mentioned early in the talk about this L1, L2 comparison, but then you didn't show us any data about that comparison. So do you have anything that you can say? Like, do people, like a follow-up on this question, do people stick with their L1 motor control challenges, or do they switch?
Yeah, all right. I promise we didn't plan it. So I had a couple of slides just in case someone asks. So yeah, within participants, so we can actually compare the L1 and L2 performance here. So just to take one of the many behavioral measures, this is the reading rate, so words per minute. And the correlation of what people do in their first and second language is very strong, right? So over 0.5% of the variance of what they do in English is explained by the same metric in their L1. And so it could be, of course, that language proficient, if a person is proficient in language, they will be proficient in their first and the second, so there's that component. But I also think it has something to do with cognitive speed and the overall strategy of reading a text. And I won't spend too much time on this, but every bar here is an eye movement measure. And the height of the bar corresponds to the percent of variance explained in the L2 measure by the L1, by the respective L1 measure. And so all the fluency measures, eye movement measures are right here. And first of all, we're explaining quite a bit of variance in all of these. And in each bar, what comes from our first language, L1, is the orange part. And you can see that this accounts for most of the variance. So what we do in our first language spills over to our second language, even though the proficiency in English was very different, right, across countries. We could count on fairly similar proficiency in their first language. They're university students, they went through school, entrance exams, whatnot. For English, it was much more variable. Still, we're bringing oculomotor control, our quirks and hiccups and the strategies from our first language to our second language.
I just wanted to ask another question that's sort of tangentially related, but so if you translate something from English to French, it takes longer to say it in French,
Yeah.
so to get the same amount of information. It's actually more words, but it's probably more words. So when you look at reading rate, or how much skipping, do people do more skipping in French, so they would actually read that in the same amount of time, get the same amount of information in the same amount of time, or would actually take longer in some languages than others to extract the same meaning?
Right. So there was a study that effectively was a predecessor and the inspiration for this one. It's called the trilingual study, and that was designed to answer exactly this question. So what they did was take texts in English, Chinese, and Finnish, right? 3 languages extremely different in all kinds of domains. And then they would translate it painstakingly sentence to sentence, right? And they must have spent years just honing their materials. And the end result of this eye tracking study was that at the level of individual words, there was huge variation, just like what we're seeing here. But to read a sentence with the same propositional content, with the same meaning, took the same amount of time to a Chinese reader versus English versus Finnish reader, which I think is mind-boggling, right? It's really a very, very strong finding. They reran it later and saw that the Chinese changed, but apparently it also coincided with the change in either the university exams. So somehow China sort of heightened the criteria for becoming a university student. So that sort of changed the equilibrium 5 years later a bit. But I still like to believe that, the overall, the total amount of effort and the total amount of time to understand a piece of meaning, right, a logically concluded piece of meaning takes is the same across languages. And that, because that gives us an idea of the division of labor. Chinese is extremely complex visually, but there are just fewer things to read. Whereas Finnish can be spelled out beautifully, but there's a lot of material to cover. Right? And the same trade-off can be said to exist in the morphology, the syntax, and so on. So I like to think that,
That's a wild result.
yeah.
Right? There's a unit of thought, like how long it takes to understand a thought.
Yeah, the expenditure of our energy to understand a thought is the same.
Yeah.
Right? So to me, it was really one of the inspirations to even start looking the cross-linguistic direction. So that.
I'll just remind everybody, there's a reception up in 205, and thank you again.